I'm very excited to introduce Kameelah Janan Rasheed, who by all accounts is a great human being, which I feel like is actually a really important thing to know about artists and people that you're working with. Kameelah is a Brooklyn-based learner from East Palo Alto, California. In her work, she inquires about the deeply intertwined spiritual, socio-political, ecological, and cognitive processes of learning/unlearning. She's interested in how proclamations of certainty, containment, and absolute knowing assert themselves through language systems, institutions, and relationships. Rasheed makes her inquiries visible through an ecosystem of iterative and provisional projects, including sprawling, Xerox-based, architecturally scaled collages, interactive publications, large-scale text banner installations, digital archives, lecture performances, library interventions, poems and poetic gestures, and other forms yet to be determined. Rasheed has exhibited at the 2017 Venice Biennial, ICA Philadelphia, Pinchuk Art Center, Brooklyn Museum, Queens Museum, New Museum, Studio Museum of Harlem, Bronx Museum, Brooklyn Public Library, Schomburg Center for Research and Black Culture, and The Kitchen, among others. She's the author of 2 artist books, An Alphabetical Accumulation of Approximate Observations, which is wonderful to say out loud, and No New Theories. Please join me in welcoming Kameelah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Last night I gave an artist talk, and then I flew out to Seattle this morning right after that. And this is my last talk of the year, so I'm really excited that it's happening not in New York, and it gets to happen in Seattle and somewhere outside of sort of the scope of where I usually give talks. I'm also really excited because I feel like I've gotten to this point of like thinking a lot about my practice. And so this is sort of like what I'm calling a leaky offering of past work, current obsessions, future research curiosities, autobiographical bits, questions, and quiet prayers. And so this is sort of like me trying to not so much tie up 2019, but to sort of think through the relationships in my work and sort of the influences for the work that I'm producing. So here's me. I always start a bit autobiographically because it makes so much sense in thinking about the way that I make work. As Kemi noted in the bio, I grew up in a small town called East Palo Alto, which is in Northern California. And there are many things that people know about the city, but one of the things that people really don't know about the city is this sort of experimental nature around schooling and education projects and publication. And so most photos of me are either me with a book or me, on the other hand, raising my hand, answering a question that no one has asked, and being very, very annoying. As I later learned, I didn't think it was annoying at the time. I thought I was just being astute and preemptive. My mother later explained to me, people weren't fond of it. But I was super eager about these engagements. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that I have the opportunity to sort of engage with really interesting teachers. Even though our school district was very poor, I happen to have like this Black science teacher, Mr. Barksdale, and I've tried to find him. I cannot find him to save my life. But we used to do things like go to Coyote Point and dissect owl pellets, which is basically owl poop, to figure out what owls had eaten. And he also used to take us on these trips to San Francisco Creek, which is a creek that ran through our neighborhood to collect water samples. And on occasion, he would let me order whatever I wanted from the Biological Carolina catalog, which is a catalog of like science supplies, which for a 5th grader, and now I'm owning my nerdiness, was super exciting to be able to flip through this book and like get to order the Daphnia that I wanted or the type of pipettes that I wanted. And so ending up in East Palo Alto in no way was a mistake. My parents both grew up in California. Their parents migrated from the South during the Great Migration, like a lot of Black folks. My mother's family settled in Southern California. My father's family settled in Northern California. And so when they finished school at UC San Diego in the late 1970s, they moved up to the city of East Palo Alto. This is them again. My dad used to be a runner. My mom, not a runner, but I don't know why. I guess he just wanted to run. She didn't want to run. But in this photo here, it's basically the same photo, and I've asked my parents about this a couple of times, of this photo of them sitting on the same couch. You see the doubling here, but the photo not being of them together. And so I feel very grateful that my parents decided to move to East Palo Alto because one of the other things that I have the opportunity to take advantage of was this publishing program. And it was basically this old woman who would sit in a trailer, and in that trailer she had a typewriter and a bunch of paper and binding supplies. And so you could go to her and you could say, hey, I want to make a book. And I was a very, very eager 7 and 8-year-olds. So I spent a lot of my lunchtime in this trailer with this woman because I wanted to make books, and I thought, wow, who else is gonna make books at lunch? It was me and just a few other students. And so before I left 2nd grade, I had published what I keep saying is a dozen books. My mom keeps correcting me and saying it's only 6. We're gonna say it's somewhere in between, so 9 books. And a really cool feature of this process was that they encouraged us to write about the author sections in our books. And so, what does a 6-year-old have to say about their life? But I had something to say. I'm 6 years old, my mom is a nice lady. I'm nice like my mom. I have 6 people in my house. I have more people. I have 15 people. My grandpa died. My name is Kameelah. You see, I'm struggling here with like order of sentences. My mom says there are not 15 people in my house, and so she's still trying to figure out who I was seeing or what was happening. By the time that I'm 7 years old, I have a last name. So my name is Kameelah Rasheed. I'm 7 years old and go to Flood School. 7 years old is very young, but I like to read, write, and do art. That is not parallel structure, but that's fine. I live in East Palo Alto. I'm in the 2nd grade. I'm a good reader. And so these about the authors were really exciting because they would invite people from the neighborhood to come and listen to like 6 and 7-year-olds like read their books. This one is like when I was a baby, and I clearly wrote this when I was 7, and I thought that I had so much to reflect on at 7 that I wrote a book about when I was a baby. And I also wrote one book called Luna, which was a science fiction book about a planet that was stealing resources from another planet to repopulate and create its own planet. And this whole story about like responsibility and sharing. And I decided to make it sort of like an interplanetary story. I really should have continued with that work, but maybe I can revive it in this context. And so, with all that being said, I don't want to say before I became an artist, but at a very, if we were thinking about linearly, before I became an artist with a capital A, I was a high school teacher. So very much of what I make sense of the world and how I make sense of everything that I do is sort of organized around learning. And so I've been very clear about not calling myself an artist and have been sort of positioning myself as a learner. And I've been doing that for a couple of reasons. The first, I think that we're all learners. Anyone who asserts any type of certainty is a fool. And I will say that with certainty that you are a fool. And I also think that learning sort of puts me in a position of being able to make mistakes and to learn and to be sort of like an example about what does it mean to learn publicly, to fail publicly, to make mistakes, and to invite other people into that process. So I think about myself as a learner, and I'm seeking to make all my inquiries visible and to a certain extent through this ecosystem of iterative, provisional, and durationally indeterminate experiments that end when I leave this dunya. And dunya just means, in Islam, just like this temporality, this world. And I added this note because when I was giving the talk last night, there were a couple of questions about like the time frame of my work, and I was like, yeah, none of my products really end, they just keep going. And then when I die, assuming that someone doesn't pick it up after me, that's when they end. And so sort of thinking about my process as a learner being one that's sort of a sentence that continues to go on and on and on, with the goal of not sort of fixing artificial boundaries around like when a process or when a thing is done, but sort of leaving myself open to the possibility that anything that I think is done could become undone as I'm learning and making sense of new things. And so there are a bunch of things I'm interested in my work, and one of the hardest things about my brain and my life is that I'm interested in so many things and there's such limited time. So when I was putting together this slide, I was like, I'm gonna make the most concise slide possible to talk about all the things I'm super interested in. And then I recognized the deep irony of trying to create something coherent and concise for a presentation that is essentially about the ridiculousness of coherency, the ridiculousness of trying to fix things into fixed packages. But with that being said, legibility is still a thing. And so a couple of things that I'm really interested in is like the learning process. And I think about that as a spiritual process, as a socio-political project, as an ecological process, and as a cognitive process. I think about things around certainty, and when people say, I know that for sure, ideas around containment and coherence and absolute knowing, and how those things assert themselves in language, how they assert themselves in the way that institutions, particularly schools, are structured, and thinking about architecture as yet another structure that sort of articulates the sense of containment and certainty and coherence. I'm also super interested in secret languages, ideas around opacity, evasiveness, and counter-surveillance, and ways of sort of like evading detection. I'm interested in the ideas of run-on sentences, leaking containers, porous membranes in the roof, which I'll talk about a little bit. And I was gonna say finally, but that word doesn't really exist in my lexicon at this point, but another thing worth mentioning is I'm really interested in thinking about ways of knowing that exceed academic validation, ways of knowing that decenter humans as the sole producers and distributors of knowledge. So like plants know things and they distribute that knowledge in many different ways. And thinking about the syncretic, the experimental, and the transdisciplinary ways of knowing and narrating that knowing. So I would like to say that as I'm speaking, at any point that someone has a question, you're more than welcome to interrupt me, because I will just keep going. If you don't interrupt me, then it's over. So just let me know if there's a question or a comment as I'm going through. So I sort of broke up the presentation to a couple of parts, and the first part I'm going to focus on is on this futile pursuit of comprehensiveness, certainty, containment, and absolute knowing. And this is this is what's interesting about where I ended up at the end of 2019. This is a moment of vulnerability for me, of like in the beginning of the year being diagnosed with anxiety disorder, which meant that I really, really needed to understand and control and make sense of everything. But in my work, being the only place that I'm able to actually make that okay to not know things. And so thinking about my work as sort of this place of like relief, like a valve where I'm okay with uncertainty and I'm okay with not knowing everything. And so I've sort of organized this presentation thinking around the 99 names of Allah. So I'm Muslim. I figured people can figure that out. Some people really don't know. They're like, "Are you Muslim?" I was like, "Really, guys?" But just in case. And so the 99 names of Allah are like these 99 names that that Allah has like assumed for Himself, that you can find throughout the Quran, that other folks have sort of collected. And I've been really fascinated with them, because I've been really fascinated with mathematics and numbers, and the idea of naming something and what a name does in the sense that it constrains or ascribes a perimeter around something, in the ways that like 99 names are an attempt to ascribe finality. And so each part of this will sort of start with one of the 99 names, because all of them end up being quite interesting to me. The first one I want to actually talk about is Al-Jami, and that's actually the name that my husband took. His name is Jami, and it actually has something to do with collecting, gathering, covering, sort of bringing together disparate parts. And what's interesting about this to me, at least, is that my husband and I met in like a mid-2010 typical way on the social medias. We met on Tumblr because we both had Tumblr blogs, which were trying to collect all this information about Black religious communities. And I remember either he messaged me or I messaged him, can't remember the exact situation, but we were supposed to meet up to talk about our blogs, which I'm like, but whatever, that's what happened. And then he canceled on me. And I was like, whoa, okay, dude. I really wanted to talk about our blogs and our gathering efforts. And then he found me maybe a year or two later on Instagram, and then he got my number by some tricky procedures. But I bring up this story because there was something about both of us that drew us together in this attempt to sort of collect and gather and pull everything together and to make it into this coherent whole. I was trying to build off this entire catalog of Black spiritual experiences in North America. That was like my goal, and he was trying to do something similar. And it's really a futile task because there's almost no way to actually do the thing that we were trying to do. And so in my attempt to sort of reconcile my desire to know a lot, but also my humility before the impossibility of that, I come back to this image a lot, the estimated size of the universe. And I love this image because in the tiny, tiny middle, that's us. And then around that is sort of a description of the observable universe. So what technology and calculations allow for us to predict or see outside of our actual planet. And then everything else is like the estimated size of the entire universe. And I want to note here that it says estimated. And I also want to note the difference in size between where we are and everything else. And this is really interesting to me because we often make such disproportionate assertions when that is like impossible. If you think about that being the planet Earth and us being a speck on the planet Earth, we're making assertions about so many things that we just can't actually conceive of. And I remember first looking at this image and feeling like very defeated, like then what's the point of trying to like learn things? But then actually having this moment of like extreme exhilaration of being like, well, I could just be wrong about a bunch of stuff and that's okay too. And so with that being said, a lot of my practice is sort of organized around not making proclamations about things, but actually surrendering to the fact that like anything that I produce as an artist, as a writer, as a whoever, will need to be revised, updated, redacted, corrected, reimagined, and it sort of puts me in a position of constantly being and making. I never get to stop making, because if I stop making, then that's sort of almost an arrogant positioning of myself as someone who has already gotten to the point. And so these are two pieces of work. They come from two different series, or maybe they're from the same series, sorry. They're from the same series, and it's a product that's up at Haverford College in Philadelphia now, which was a library project, a library intervention, where I was thinking a lot about Jorge Luis Borges' The Library of Babel, and also thinking about Suratul Kahf, which is the 18th chapter in the Holy Quran, and there's this particular verse I'm going to come up upon in a moment. And so in the work, I keep working, if you notice, this sort of engagement with these circles, thinking about the sort of pilgrimage or worshiping of the idea of certainty, like literally making a pilgrimage, circling, going through this ritual of trying to get closer and closer to certainty. And a lot of the work sort of thinking through ideas of wondering, thinking through ideas, again, of worship. And a lot of my work comes back to sort of the intersections between religious worship and ritual, and also academic worship and ritual, and thinking about the intersections there. There's a lot of like, this is secular, this is religious, and like, we're all in this game of exalting something, whether it's the notion of certainty, whether it's a notion of knowing everything, we're all in this sort of process of exalting and worshiping something, and wanting to bring my work back to thinking about those ideas. And I think in the process of trying to get to this like finite, perfect understanding of things, we run into a lot of sort of methodologies that are approximations, right? And so I keep coming back to this notion of analogy, because I find analogies to be so troubling. When people say things like, man, that was just like, I'm like, no, it's not just like, because two things are different and we don't need to equate them. And so me being really interested in this, and this is from a work that happened in Los Angeles in 2018, and this is literally carved into the wall, sort of like tipped into the wall, and it just says your analogy is a sloppy menace. And thinking about the idea of analogy being menacing, particularly when it's in an attempt to describe socio-political realities and trying to describe sort of context of suffering and context of relationality. And I want to show this excerpt from Frank Wilderson III, who is a scholar that I came across maybe a year ago, because I was reading a lot about like Black futurism, Black optimism, Black nihilism, Afro-pessimism, and kept rewatching this excerpt, and he talks a little bit about analogy, and particularly this idea of the ruse of analogy. So I'm going to play this quickly. So let's run forward. We currently do not have sound. Unless I'm doing something wrong. It's also possible.
Friends are in the streets.
Thank you.
Furthermore, in the lines, Mrs. Bullitt, I have some bad news. It's about your husband, Mr. John Frederick Bullitt, or may I call you Frida? The poem seems to realize that the integrity of gender is more properly the possession of an inanimate bullet than of a sentient Black being.
Oh, that was wrong.
The violence against Black people, which we are witnessing on YouTube videos, for violence against Black people. The antagonism between the post-colonial subject and the settler in Sand Creek cannot and should not be analogized with the violence of social death. That is the violence of slavery, which did not end in 1865 for the simple reason that slavery did not end in 1865. Slavery is a relation, not an event, not a set of experiences, and certainly not a place in space like the South. Just as colonialism is a relation, and that relational dynamic can continue to exist once the settler has left or ceded nominal power. And these two relations are secured by radically different structures of violence. We need a political and theoretical apparatus which allows Black people to not have to be burdened by the ruse of analogy, because analogy mystifies rather than clarifies Black suffering. And it mystifies Black people's relationship to other people of color. Afro-pessimism attempts to throw this dissonance into relief, unflinchingly, without being afraid of the faults and fissures that it reveals, and without worrying what people will think of the enterprise. There's a kind of compulsive.
I think it's a really good talk. You should watch the entirety of it. And I watch this a lot because I think I end up in a lot of conversations about what is happening now, and people will equate things like, that's just like slavery, or that's just like when and I'm like, dude, it's not, because it's not the same thing. And so, in thinking about this idea of trying to like get to an understanding, trying to like have precision, it always becomes an approximation, and me being really interested in grammatical structures and linguistic structures that sort of mystify as it was talking about rather than clarify, and analogy being something that I've been really interested in the past. Which sort of brought me to this excerpt from In the Wake by Christina Sharp, where she talks about anti-Blackness being a weather and a climate. And I kept thinking about this a lot in relation to Frank Wilderson, because I kept thinking to myself, wow, in the attempts to create legibility about one person suffering or one group suffering, you sort of lose the nuance of another set of suffering. And to think about anti-Blackness not as, like, as he was saying, a moment in time or a location, but as an actual climate and a weather. The attempt to analogize a sense of climate or weather of anti-Blackness to another situation becomes deeply problematic. And so a lot of times in my work, even though I can't get to the place of precision, because that precision does not exist, I'm very interested in folks who are thinking about sort of the failures of language and what happens when we settle for approximation, or at least do not provide a preamble that this approximation or this analogy does not fulfill what we wanted to do, and sort of are prematurely celebratory about the approximation or analogy. And so I started working through sort of these relationships with analogy. Your analogy is sloppy menace, membrane, mercy, messiah, metabolism, middleman, midwife, ministry, misadventure, mode. And with all that being said, again, this attempt towards certainty and to be able to articulate or narrate something perfectly brings me back to Siddhartha Kauf, which I had mentioned before, which I'll go into a little bit more in depth about now. On Fridays before the sun sets, Muslims are encouraged, sunnah or suggested, to read Siddhartha Kauf, which is chapter 18 of the Quran. And so one of the cool things about that sort of imperative or suggestion is that you keep reading the same chapter over and over, which for me is a really amazing experience of like having these many revelations along the way, or understandings or misunderstandings or mistranslations. And so there are a couple stories in Siddhartha Kauf. One is, there's a story of these boys who've been in the cave for several years, and people are trying to like figure out how many years they've been in the cave, and there's like this reminder of like not to make guesses at things that you don't need to make guesses for, like let things be what they are. And there's this other story between Moses and Khadr, where they're going on this journey, and Khadr lets Moses go on this journey with them, but he's like, chill, don't ask me a bunch of questions about what I'm doing. And Moses is like, got it, I'm not gonna do it. And then as soon as the journey starts, he starts asking questions. He's like, what does that mean? And Khadr's like, I told you to chill, don't keep asking questions. And so they keep going, and they eventually part ways. Because Moses couldn't be patient enough just to let the thing unfold without trying to seek certainty or trying to seek an answer. And so this story is very interesting for me in sort of thinking about our inability to go along with something without there being a clear endpoint or a clear purpose. But then the chapter also ends, this is the second to last ayat of verse, where it says, say if the sea were ink for writing the words of my Lord, the sea would be exhausted before the words of my Lord were exhausted, even if we brought the like of it as a supplement. There have been tons of interpretation about this, but the way that I've sort of made sense of this is a reminder that what we know, or what we think we know, is so small in relation to what there is possible for knowing, and so any attempt to be coherent or any attempt to assert certainty ends up being silly, because what we literally have in our hands is such a small fraction of what's actually available. And if that is indeed the case, then it's sort of a reminder to like pump your brakes and to be okay with not knowing, and to be okay with sort of the sense of fragility as you press forward. I've been, as I said, been reading a lot of Jorge Luis Borges, and one of his books, The Book of Imaginary Beings, in the 1967 version, there is an introduction to this book, and the Book of Imaginary Beings is literally just a book of these monsters and beings and creatures that have appeared in literature and religious texts. And I really became fascinated with sort of the organization of like encyclopedias and reference texts because they're designed to give a comprehensiveness of the world. So a book that's a naturalist text is supposed to tell you all the animals that exist in the world, which is like silly, because as soon as you publish that book, another animal will be found, and then your book is ruined, and it doesn't need to be published anymore, right? So this idea of publishing these books, which are supposed to be finite, finished products, that are impossible to be finite, finished products. So in his introduction, he says, a book of this nature is necessary and complete. Each new edition is the core of future editions, which may be multiplied to infinity. And then he goes on to say, like all miscellanies, like those inexhaustible volumes by Robert Burton Fraser Quinney, the Book of Imaginary Beings has not been written for consecutive reading. Our wish would be that the curious dip into it from time to time, in much the way one visits the changing forms revealed by a kaleidoscope. And I thought this was such like a beautiful way to sort of start a text, this idea that this book is already incomplete at its start, that anything that we sort of say or make is anachronistic as soon as the sentence is completed, but also this very beautiful idea that it's not meant for consecutive reading, but for dipping in and out, with the goal of dipping in and out being an opportunity to reveal new things. And sort of in thinking about this goal towards completion, I found something on Wikipedia, which I don't think was intentional as far as Wikipedia, because I don't think they write poets, but I found something like really beautiful and poetic on Wikipedia. So anytime you see a list, a dynamic list, which is like a list that changes, they have like a little note, and it says, this is a dynamic list that may never be able to satisfy particular standards for completeness. And I thought, wow, that's such like a beautiful thing that Wikipedia has included as a reference text. And so I've sort of taken this on as sort of like my mantra for life, but also for my practice. In no way is a thing that I'm putting out to a world for an exhibit, for a book, ever going to satisfy any standards for completeness, and that's sort of being the entry point or the ritual for engaging in my work. With that being said, last summer I had the privilege of publishing my first artist book, and I was so excited. It was called No New Theories, and it was about like the failure of theory, the need to like theorize Black people, and I had work and I had interviews. And so I go to Print and Matter and I pick up my books, and I'm like, dope, great, I take them home, I'm taking pictures, I'm on Instagram, like everybody should buy my book, blah, 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 blah. I'm like super geeked about it. And I get home and I don't open them immediately because I'm like, I know what they look like. And then a friend of mine is like, oh, send me pictures. So I'm like flipping through the book, I'm like, cool, cool, cool. And I was like, yeah, that doesn't look right. And I keep flipping, like, that doesn't look right. And so what we realized is that there were some misprints. And then I go crazy, because of course no one wants a misprinted book circulating in the world. And so I remember texting the editor being like, take them off the shelves, burn everything. Him being like, first of all, it's like the middle of the night, so please stop. But also second, like it's fine, like books have misprints. But I had like this very, very clear moment of being like, but I don't have misprints. Other people can have them, but I don't. And so what was interesting about this process was that a book had been published, it had been circulated, people had bought it, and people were like texting me like, hey girl, I got your book, and I was like, don't read it right now, it's not the right book. But there's like this deep sense of like anxiety that overcame me because something that I had created, that I had in my mind positioned as being completed was undone. And what that meant for my own practice, because I talk a big game, right, about like incompleteness and incoherency. It's so sexy and romantic to be incomplete and incoherent. But then as soon as it happened to me, I wasn't with it. I was not with it. And so I have this whole sort of like really depressive 2018 summer because I have thought about, I was already critical of the book as a product because of the sense of finality that I couldn't go back and edit, because I go back and change my installations over time. And so this book, I was like, I gotta make sure it's perfect. And when it didn't come out, it was overwhelming. And so what ended up happening is that Print and Matter, being the wonderful people that they are, were like, those people in, I don't remember where it was, somewhere in Europe that starts with B that I can't remember at this time, not Berlin, but another place. What's another place that starts with B?
Brussels, Belgrade.
Guys are smart. They were the people who made the mistake. So we're gonna reprint their book. So from the beginning of 2018 until literally like a few weeks ago, I have been basically working on a new edition of the book, which expanded 100 pages, and instead of sort of running away from the idea that there was a misprint, basically redid the interview, and so now the interview is sort of formatted in this way where it has the interview and it has annotations and pieces of text sort of like added in. And the purpose of doing that was like, aesthetically I'm interested in how annotations and sort of collage elements work, but I also wanted to like give greater permission to learning publicly, to revising publicly, to redacting publicly, to like making a mistake. And what that means for learning, if we are to ever collectively learn and then move through that learning, means that people have to be willing to be like, yeah, actually that wasn't the first try didn't go away, I wanted, the second try will probably also have misprints, and this will be sort of talked about through public programming. And so I remember showing an excerpt of that at a recent, or maybe it was a couple months ago at a talk, and then I showed this slide. And someone's like, oh, did you get your aesthetic from your dad? And I was like, no, my dad's a pharmacy technician. I got nothing from him. And then I said, oh, actually, I did. And so this is actually, so my parents converted to Islam in the early 1980s. And my parents were both like, my mom is like super critical of religion, and my dad had like traveled through like 50 different religious groups. Doesn't exaggerate, but he like traveled through a lot of different groups trying to figure out, and he always gave this metaphor of like, it was like a buffet. I was going from community to community, taking a bit of this, taking a bit of that, but never feeling full. And so in his process of learning about Islam, he basically would type out these notes, sometimes in the back of his pharmacy school work. And then he would type out stuff, and he would cut out pieces of the Quran, and he would cut out pieces of other books, and then he would have like these like large annotations all across it. And there's tons of these pages. And I remember finding these a couple years ago and being fascinated. I was like, he was serious. And not only was he serious, there was almost this sense of like permission to actually be engaged in like talking back to a text. So instead of the Quran being this passive text that you just accept as it is, he was engaged in this like very intertextual process of like engaging with the thing that would have been presented to him and having notes and taking things and adding all of these things. And I got excited because as I got older and learned more, I realized that this sort of this choice to engage with holy texts is like a thing that Black folks have done throughout history, from either writing your own holy texts to like editing them. And if you think about Octavia Butler's Parable of Silver, there's Laura Elamina who like is in the process of writing her own holy text. So all these things started coming together for me, and me getting really excited about Black textual production and sort of the ways that my dad sort of like implicitly influenced my practice. And I included one of his pieces in a recent show that I had at Brooklyn Historical Society. And he's like, I don't remember doing that. And I was like, well, thanks, because I do. And I'll also note, you guys remember when Adrian Piper had those little cards that said, you may not know that I'm Black, but I am. You offended me. So my dad made a card like that before Adrian Piper. And I want to explain. So basically when he became Muslim, he changed his name. So he made a card that he would pass out, printed up business cards that said, my name was Ricky, I no longer go by that name, please call me by Kamal Rasheed. And he would pass these out to people. And so I reproduced them for a show back in 2016, and people were like, oh, is it Adrian Piper now? And I was like, no, literally my dad did this before Adrian Piper. And I note this because there's this interesting moment for me of looking back at my dad and realizing that he was like his own little conceptual artist, and I didn't know it, and then like all these things are sort of servicing for me in my own work of sort of thinking about intertextual relationships and the way that we engage with our family who don't identify necessarily as artists or makers, but are doing things that are in the same register, even if they are not assigned the same status. And so in thinking about this attempt towards coherency, a lot of my practice is organized around archiving things. I collecting things. If we go back to Jami again, think about this idea of trying to collect, gather, sort, and organize information. And sort of my first entry into collecting and archiving was sort of like a response to trauma. Our family, we were in Northern California, was made homeless and houseless back in 1998. And in the process of that happening, we had to move, and we lost a lot of stuff. Photographs, books, all the stuff that you would sort of have as sort of markers or ephemera that like mark your presence in the world. And so without actually knowing what I was doing for a long time, I would just like collect a lot of stuff. Notebooks, photographs, anything that was sort of like, this is a marker of my presence. And so as I've gotten older, the sort of archival scope has like narrowed, and I started collecting a lot of Black printed matter. And I had a show at New Museum back in 2018 around Black education and Black institution building. I decided to focus on Black publishing presses and Black publishing initiatives, and just basically spent my entire budget building out an entire archive of about 300 pieces of Black printed matter, which I got to take with me. So anytime you get a budget, just let me know. You should figure out what to do with it. In this case, I bought an entire archive. And so my first impulse was like, I got to get all the things that exist in the world, right? That are from this particular time period. I was like, I got it. I have mad research skills. Like, I got this. And in the process of doing that, I got very overwhelmed and sort of like defeated because I realized that people own things, and they own them not because of an interest in these particular histories, but because of a capital interest in like how these things can be sold and circulated, or people just had stuff because they wanted to hold on to it as an object for private viewing and not for public viewing. But in the process of doing that, found a lot of great stuff. For folks who know the Kitchen Table Press, that was started up in the Northeast with Barbara Smith. I was able to acquire 4 of their Freedom Organizing series, which are these pamphlets that include summaries of like social problems at the time, and then in the back also include organizations to get involved with. Also have a ton of stuff from ACHE, which is a publication of Black lesbians up in Northern California. Just tons of stuff, and making it public, and making it public in ways that people don't actually have to go through the security of archives, which is signing up to say that you're qualified to look at them, that you have a research project. But basically anyone who wants to engage with them during these pop-ups can engage with them. Kid, adult, doesn't matter, as long as you can show up or I can come to you, they're available. And so these are a few other pieces as well. Just scan through these quickly. I think one of the most interesting things about this for me has been who owns a lot of this, and me thinking about the recent conversations around repatriation of African artifacts, and me being really interested in like what repatriation of Black printed matter in the US looks like as well. There are lots of people who are not Black who own these things and hold on to these things, and me being interested in what does it look like for these things to be with Black institutions or with Black private collectors so that people can have greater access to them. And so this is my like small effort to like get these things. The one on the left side, the National Black Silent Majority Committee, is the most hilarious thing I've read. So basically, the New York Times is like printing out its clippings, and someone emailed me and was like, yo, do you want them? And so basically they like sent me this giant, like maybe 10 or 12 boxes of clippings. And one of them in there was the National Black Silent Majority Committee, which was a Black crusade for patriotism where they were vowing to be silent and not to like agitate, because the Panthers were agitating and they weren't with that agitation and round up the elements. And I just was like, this is the most fascinating thing. It was National Black Silent Majority Committee, and I felt like maybe it was like a Kevin Quashie like quietness, and it wasn't that type of quiet. It was like the wrong quiet. But there are interesting things that sort of surface through the archives. I also have like a large archive of Black vernacular photographs, and photographs of Black folks being Black folks out in everyday life. And I started this question because when my family became homeless, we lost a lot of photographs. So when I was in Berkeley, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and I remember going to a flea market with my mom, and I found like this bin of Black photographs, and I just was like, asked the guy how much they were, and they weren't too expensive, so I bought them, and then started looking through them, looking for people who look like my family, and I'm sure there was like a peak of hope that like maybe some of our photos were in there, but becoming really interested in what does it mean to like take these photos out of circulation, and what does it also mean to like show them. So there are about 4,000 of these now. They're in the process of being scanned. I'm still trying to figure out what does it mean for them to be public, because these people don't have their own photos, and what does it mean to like make them public, to have people use them without permission. In this effort to archive, again, it's gone a lot of different directions, but at the core, this is sort of thinking about how we consume and how we archive and how we make sense of lived Black experience. And one of the elements, if you haven't already picked up, is spirituality is deeply important to me because of my parents' sort of like trajectory, but also because of how important spirituality is for me in my current life. And so back in 2015, I received a grant from Triple Canopy to basically work on this project looking at these early 20th century Black religious communities that don't really fall on they're not like the Baptist Church or like the Nation of Islam. They're lesser known communities. And so I wanted to focus on underexposed, lesser known communities, and decided to focus on a group called the Moorish Science Temple of America, and published this project, which again had to have a final stopping point, but didn't really end as the work is continuing, which I'll show you in a moment. And so it was an essay, I gotcha. It was an essay that sort of, you know what? There we go. It was an essay that sort of talked through like my interest in thinking about Black religious experiences and sort of thinking about the processes of archiving. I talked a little bit about Laura Olamina and Parable Solar, and thinking about this idea of audacity amongst Black folks to like create our own religions, create our own texts, to sort of like put things together to create the thing that you needed. And a lot of it also goes into some family history and goes into like my collection. I also have a collection of religious tracts, so like the things that people slide under your doors. Most people throw them away. I decided to keep them all, and they're quite fascinating. My house, I don't know why my husband still lives with me. As I think about that, I'm like, that house is full of like archives. But the goal is to sort of really think about religion and spirituality as a fertile ground for where a lot of Black folks were able to innovate and to make sense of creating an identity and culture for themselves. And so that essay talks about a lot of those things, includes some archival matter, also includes some photographs that I took of a friend who joined the Moorish Science Temple a few years ago, and he's a good friend of mine. I've known him through like all the religions he's ever been in. This is him right here. And so out of that project, I also got a grant from the Magnum Foundation to create this website and this archival project called Mapping the Spirit, which is an attempt to document these different permutations of lived Black experience with regard to spiritual life. And so I created an archive of the Moorish Science Temple. I spent about a year with folks in Philly, taking photographs, and I worked with someone who's now a friend of mine, Corey Tigler, to design this website. He did such an amazing job. But you can do things like drag these things down, create your own collection of things. This is from an event that happened in Philly back in 20...
particular way. And if we all stayed in line with the prophets, all would be well. The confusion comes on board.
We lost sound. I'll keep pushing through the website, even though there are also elements here where if you click this fella, you're able to zoom in to see some of the archival images that are there. And so the site is a work in progress. I just interviewed the top leader of the Moorish Science Temple and just got the interview transcribed, so like working through where that lives. But this project, like I said, like all the projects sort of like live and continue to live on until like I'm not here anymore. Another archival, and as you'll notice, there are like, obviously many things that I'm working on simultaneously. That's because I can never finish anything because they just are not done. And so it's sort of this process of having an ethos for how I engage with work and then creating many things and sort of working at the pace at which the project unfolds itself organically. And so like I said, I'm from East Palo Alto, so I've been spending a lot of time doing research in the city and received some grant money and support to do a project around this. And I'm gonna show you guys a video of my city. And so this is sort of the image of my city that most folks have, which is not the only image, but it's also why I'm interested in this archiving of this hyper-local context of my city. Oops.
Now, coming up next tonight, Eye on America. We'll be taking you to the most dangerous neighborhood in the country. America.
Lost sound again.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Maybe the speaker is, can we pull this speaker and just use the laptop?
Yeah.
Thank
Will that work? No worries. No need to apologize. There's no sound on the...
I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Oh, no.
You might have to go to system preferences.
Thanks, Ralph. Yeah.
On the right side.
Yep. So I'll tell a story while we're waiting. Before I came, you guys know who Big Frida is?
Mm-hmm.
You know Big Frida has a show?
So nice.
Yes, I saw Big Frida in front of the hotel that I was at. And I was like, are you Big Frida? And they were like, yes. I was like, okay, bye. That's the end of the story. But had I known, I would have definitely got tickets. I'm like, no. Does anyone else have tickets to go? No? Okay.
I think, yeah, let's see.
I know that's the question.
Should you try it again?
So, yeah, I'm so sorry. We're trying out a new sound system
happens.
and didn't work.
So we're gonna have you super quiet. Listen to the computer.
One nation with tens of thousands of neighborhoods, some good, some bad. And if you were to point at one of the bad neighborhoods and ask how it got that way, you might find the people there pointing right back at you. John Blackstone reports tonight's Eye on America.
Once you know where your plan is, then you know where you're gonna plant everything.
Protecting young life can sometimes be such a challenge.
across the freeway, what they're mentioning is like Stanford University, Palo Alto, Atherton, some of the richest neighborhoods. And so why I'm showing that video is like, imagine being like a kid and that's what you see about your city constantly, but also going to school and seeing like slightly a bit of a different reality, and that like you have teachers who are like helping you make books and you're doing all these things like collecting water samples. And being very curious as a young person as to why that was the only thing of our city's context that was shared. And so being really interested in thinking through what archival matter sort of exists about my city that's worth exploring and worth sort of like amplifying. And a lot of that came out of that was me basically digging around and recognizing that it was hard to find a lot of stuff, but was able to start finding stuff by basically just showing up at places and being like, can I have that? So I found this Black Panther newspaper excerpt from 1972. I found it when I went to San Francisco. There's a place called Freedom Archives. It's literally just like a walk up in a guy's office, and he was like, here, take some photos, and that's where I found this. And this is basically about community survival programs. And our city tried to rename itself Nairobi back in the late 1960s. And what's exciting about this excerpt is that the Black Panther writer for this article is actually critical of our attempts to rename our city. And he writes, or they write rather, certain progressive people within the community of East Palo Alto attempted to rename it Nairobi through a City Hall initiative in 1969 to give the people a feeling of self-determination. However, the initiative failed to pass. The idea that if people are aware of their heritage, they will then be free is naive. Because we acknowledge that we are Black people who came to this country, and change does not mean that we will have the food to eat, clothes to wear, shelter over our heads. Only through real and tangible things can we begin to organize and educate the people to the significance of our real heritage, from the great kingdom of ancient Africa through chattel slavery and up into the oppression we suffer today. Slaves can never be free by just acknowledging their slavery. I was so excited when I read this that I was like, ooh, critique. Back in the 1970s between Black organizations that were trying to make sense of something, but finding these gems in the archive that sort of talked about that. I'm not going to show this video because we don't have time, but I would just suggest that you do see this. One of the really cool things about my city is that from the late 1960s up into the early 1980s, before the city incorporated, in 1983 we had something called the Nairobi Day Schools and the Nairobi Colleges. The day schools and the Nairobi Colleges were an accredited K through 14 system, so community college and K through 12. And it was the only Black-run, Black organized schools in the nation. And we did this by basically folks in the community who did not have college degrees, that did not have a lot of support, but basically were upset with sort of the state of education and basically just started their own schools, got accredited, and held classes in homes, churches, street corners, wherever they found space. And this is a spread from Ebony News, from Ebony Magazine about these schools. This is a text from the Day School EPA. You'll notice that it says by the Day School people, which I think is really beautiful to sort of think about this collective authorship. And that in addition to publishing this book, they also created a publishing initiative called the Mothers for Equal Education Bookstore and Publication Effort. There's also something called the Black Liberation Publishers. Both of these things were found in Schaumburg up in New York. And part of this process has been this curious question for me as to why none of these things exist in the city of East Palo Alto, but are rather dispersed through lots of institutions throughout the country. So UC Berkeley has stuff, Stanford has stuff, University of Michigan has stuff. Whenever you go, you're repeatedly told that you can't duplicate or publish any of this stuff. And so for me, it's a very frustrating process of seeing things that are from my community, that are about my community, that I can't actually use because they're owned by an institution. This is some of the text inside of the Black Liberation publisher's text, and he basically mentions how important it was that Black folks were involved in every part of the publication, from the making to the typing to the binding to the printing. He wanted to ensure, he writes, the author and his stubborn refusal to allow white publishers to exploit a Black thing has in fact guaranteed Black people employment along every step in the decision-making process related to the production of the book, as well as having Black people employed to do the actual production work on this book. And so thinking about Black publishing efforts and what does it mean to own your means of production and to be able to have sort of a beacon for articulating your worldviews. And so those are some examples of like archiving that I think are, I was gonna say useful, but that word seems too bound to productivity and capitalism, but important. But on a more scary note, at least for me, have people heard of something called the Arch Mission? They are a group of people who have been who have self-deputized to create a backup disk for civilization. And so they basically have created these libraries of books and languages that if the world were destroyed and people found this disk, that they could restart the world. Can anyone guess as to why this could possibly be a problem? Yeah, right? So this idea that a group of people have deputized themselves to do this means that I'm sure there's tons of knowledge of people who are going to be excluded from how civilization was restarted. So you guys can already guess how this is going to go. So I've been keeping my tabs on them. I've joined their mailing list. I know their website. If you are restarting the Earth, I would like to have a role in it. And so thinking about this attempt towards coherence and organizing takes you to this moment of, as we're wrapping up, thinking about ideas of sort of like counting and reckoning and sort of numbering and computing things. And so, like I said at the beginning, I've been really interested in math as like a system of logic that sort of organizes and makes sense of things, this idea of accounting. So one of the other 99 names of Allah, Al-Wusi, thinks about the idea of reckoning, appraising, and counting. And the root of the word has to do with counting, recording, comprehending, and possessing full comprehension of. And so in a lot of these questions around counting, I've been doing these works that are sort of thinking through approximations or counting towards a marker of emancipation, right? So this is at the 2017 Venice Biennial. Also, by the way, I did not enjoy Venice. That was a very terrible experience. Who thought it was a good idea to build a city on water? You can't even get Uber to where you need to go. It was not a pleasant experience. But one of the highlights for me was being able to have this work there. And one of the things I've noticed about my work is it's very Instagrammable because it's text and it's design-based. And so people were taking tons of pictures like, yeah, we're definitely there. Yeah, we had a black president. We had this. Like, we did it, y'all. And I was like, oh, this is so interesting to me because people are answering the question before even challenging the premise of the question, right? So are we there yet? Who is the we? Where is the there? And what is the yet? But people were so quick to immediately respond, yes, we are there because of this one instance that has occurred. And I've already, again, deputized myself to speak for everyone. And so in a lot of my work, when I'm thinking about sort of positioning these questions in public or semi-public spaces, it's not so much that I want people to answer them with a sense of finality, but I actually want us to question the premise of questions and why we feel compelled to answer a question without interrogating who asked the question, why they asked the question, and what's at stake in the process of answering that question. And so this work was also up at Brooklyn Museum in the Brick Arcade. There are several questions. Are we there yet? After hope, then what? And right now in Austria, there's a video projection of this in a large public space. We haven't seen, because I've been to Austria yet, but should be getting video soon. And so there's just like this set of rotating questions that are sort of getting us to think about, are we there yet? After hope, then what? Is this the last time? And did you think it would get easier after this? And a lot of this has to do with sort of like reading the fine print. And so a lot of times when we speak about social change, there's sort of like this one event that sort of is a marker. It's like the equation, like 1 + 1 = this thing. And so this reminder to read the fine print or to not be charmed by this notion of a perfect freedom. Which got me again thinking about order of operations. There's a lot of conversation about what emancipation looks like for Black folks, what liberation looks like for Black folks. And I think a lot of these conversations feel like this funny thing where we did Please Excuse My Dear Aunt Sally, where we were trying to figure out, do you do the parentheses first, the exponents first, the multiplication first? And I think about in conversation around liberation and emancipation, there's also this question around, are we hopeful first and then we fight? Do we fight first and then get hopeful? What is the order of operations for both our affective articulation and actually what we're doing out in the world? And so being really interested in this idea of map and starting to design a body of work, which was just at Expo Chicago, that will be in Berlin next week. Yep, I should remember that. Next week. And it's a body of work called A Casual Mathematics that thinks about math as sort of a conceit for thinking about our language and articulation around liberation politics. And so there are about 19 pieces and growing in this work, and they're arranged in this sort of collage-like fashion. But I'm going to show you some of the individual pieces. There's one that says 1 + 1 = 2, and follows up with we're already human, and then as a reminder, not yet. And then as another reminder, but lazy equations can trick our efforts. So thinking about these moments where we say, we got a Black president, or this thing happened, and that being this lazy equation. That was for me, wasn't it? Oh, okay. Good. Also thinking about ideas around perimeters and measuring the circumference of something. Also attempted to rename it Nairobi through a City Hall initiative in 1969 to give the people a feeling of self-determination. However, the initiative failed to pass. The idea that if people are aware of their heritage, they will then be free is naive. Because we acknowledge that we are Black people who came to this country, and change does not mean that we will have the food to eat, clothes to wear, shelter over our heads. Only through real and tangible things can we begin to organize and educate the people to the significance of our real heritage, from the great kingdom of ancient Africa through chattel slavery and up into the oppression we suffer today. Slaves can never be free by just acknowledging their slavery. I was so excited when I read this, I was like, ooh, critique. Back in the 1970s, between Black organizations that were trying to make sense of something, but finding these gems in the archive that sort of talked about that. I'm not going to show this video because we don't have time, but I would just suggest that you do see this. One of the really cool things about my city is that from the late 1960s up into the early 1980s, before the city incorporated, in 1983 we had something called the Nairobi Day Schools and the Nairobi Colleges. The day schools and the Nairobi Colleges were an accredited K through 14 system, so community college and K through 12, and it was the only Black-run, Black organized schools in the nation. And we did this by basically folks in the community who did not have college degrees, that did not have a lot of support, but basically they were upset with sort of the state of education and basically just started their own schools, got accredited, and held classes in homes, churches, street corners, wherever they found space. And this is a spread from Ebony News, from Ebony Magazine about these schools. This is a text from the Day School EPA. You'll notice that it says by the Day School people, which I think is really beautiful to sort of think about this collective authorship, and that in addition to publishing this book, they also created a publishing initiative called the Mothers for Equal Education Bookstore and Publication Effort. There's also something called the Black Liberation Publishers. Both of these things were founded in Schaumburg up in New York. And part of this process has been this curious question for me as to why none of these things exist in the city of East Palo Alto, but are rather dispersed through lots of institutions throughout the country. So UC Berkeley has stuff, Stanford has stuff, University of Michigan has stuff. Whenever you go, you're repeatedly told that you can't duplicate or publish any of this stuff. And so for me, it's a very frustrating process of seeing things that are from my community, that are about my community, that I can't actually use because they're owned by an institution. This is some of the text inside of the Black Liberation publisher's text, and he basically mentions how important it was that Black folks were involved in every part of the publication, from the making to the typing to the binding to the printing. He wanted to ensure, he writes, the author in his stubborn refusal to allow white publishers to exploit a Black thing has in fact guaranteed Black people employment along every step in the decision-making process related to the production of the book, as well as having Black people employed to do the actual production work on this book. And so thinking about Black publishing efforts and what does it mean to own your means of production and to be able to have sort of a beacon for articulating your worldviews. And so those are some examples of like archiving that I think are, I was gonna say useful, but that word seems too bound to productivity and capitalism, but important. But on a more scary note, at least for me, have people heard of something called the Arch Mission? They are a group of people who have been self-deputized to create a backup disk for civilization. And so they basically have created these libraries of books and languages that if the world were destroyed and people found this disk, that they could restart the world. Can anyone guess as to why this could possibly be a problem? Yeah, right? So this idea that a group of people have deputized themselves to do this means that I'm sure there's tons of knowledge and peoples who are going to be excluded from how civilization was restarted. So you guys can already guess how this is going to go. So I've been keeping my tabs on them. I've joined their mailing list. I go to their website. If you are restarting the Earth, I would like to have a role in it. And so thinking about this attempt towards coherence and organizing takes you to this moment of, as we're wrapping up, thinking about ideas of sort of like counting and reckoning and sort of numbering and computing things. And so, like I said at the beginning, I've been really interested in math as like a system of logic that sort of organizes and makes sense of things, this idea of accounting. So one of the other 99 names of Allah, Abusi, thinks about the idea of reckoning, appraising, and counting, and the root of the word has to do with counting, recording, comprehending, and possessing full comprehension of. And so in a lot of these questions around counting, I've been doing these works that are sort of thinking through approximations or counting towards a marker of emancipation, right? So this is at the 2017 Venice Biennial. Also, by the way, I did not enjoy Venice. That was a very terrible experience. Who thought it was a good idea to build a city on water? You can't even get Uber to where you need to go. It was not a pleasant experience. But one of the highlights for me was being able to have this work there. And one of the things that I've noticed about my work is it's very Instagrammable because it's text and it's design based. And so people were taking tons of pictures like, yeah, we're definitely there. Yeah, we had a black president. We had this. Like, we did it, y'all. And I was like, oh, this is so interesting to me because people were answering your question before even challenging the premise of the question, right? So are we there yet? Who is the we? Where is the there? And what is the yet? But people were so quick to immediately respond, yes, we are there because of this one instance that has occurred. And I've already, again, deputized myself to speak for everyone. And so in a lot of my work, when I'm thinking about sort of positioning these questions in public or semi-public spaces, it's not so much that I want people to answer them with a sense of finality, but I actually want us to question the premise of questions and why we feel compelled to answer a question without interrogating who asked the question, why they asked the question, and what's at stake in the process of answering that question. And so this work was also up at Brooklyn Museum in the Brick Arcade. There are several questions. Are we there yet? After hope, then what? And right now in Austria, there's a video projection of this in a large public space. So they haven't seen I've been to Austria yet, but should be getting video soon. And so there's just like this set of rotating questions that are sort of getting us to think about, are we there yet? After hope, then what? Is this the last time? And did you think it would get easier after this? And a lot of this has to do with sort of like reading the fine print. And so a lot of times when we speak about social change, there's sort of like this one event that sort of is a marker. It's like the equation, like 1 + 1 = this thing. And sort of this reminder to read the fine print or to not be charmed by this notion of a perfect freedom. Which got me again thinking about order of operations. There's a lot of conversation about what emancipation looks like for black folks, what liberation looks like for black folks. And I think a lot of these conversations feel like this funny thing when we did Please Excuse My Dear Aunt Sally, where we were trying to figure out, do you do the parentheses first, the exponents first, the multiplication first? And I think about in conversation around liberation and emancipation, there's also this question around, are we hopeful first and then we fight? Do we fight first and then get hopeful? What is the order of operations for both our affective articulation and actually what we're doing out in the world? And so being really interested in this idea of map and start to design a body of work, which was just at Expo Chicago, that will be in Berlin next week. Yep, I should remember that. Next week. And it's a body of work called A Casual Mathematics that thinks about math as sort of a conceit for thinking about our language and articulation around liberation politics. And so there are about 19 pieces and growing in this work, and they're arranged in this sort of collage-like fashion. But I'm going to show you some of the individual pieces. There's one that says 1 + 1 = 2, and follows up with We're Already Human, and then as a reminder, not yet. And then as another reminder, but lazy equations can trigger efforts. So thinking about these moments where we say, we got a black president, or this thing happened, and that being this lazy equation. That was for me, wasn't it? No, okay. Also thinking about ideas around perimeters, and measuring the circumference of something, and thinking about using language instead of numbers. A bar graph which sort of like increases, and as you go up, there's sort of like an increase, not in numbers, but sort of an increase in dissatisfaction or disillusionment. So getting from the place of anything that happened and being hopeful to getting to this place of pomp and circumstance or pomp and ceremony where you sort of recognize that things are not going as planned. Thinking about progress as a tangent to what we're actually working towards. Thinking about the non-revolutionary aspects of approximation. Notions that will be saved through some type of algebra or clear mathematics. Thinking about what is actually the problem, so sort of challenging the premise of our processes to begin with. Thinking about long division in the context of what does it mean to do the long, steady work and showing your work. So the ideas of showing your work versus not showing your work. What does it mean to be engaged in sort of like a long game, a long politics with relation to liberatory behavior and liberatory pursuits. There's never enough awful arithmetic, or there are never enough years. Thinking about equations being just a bit too much. Sort of like taking a tally. I don't know if people have read the essay by Calvin Warren, Black Nihilism and the Politics of Hope. It's a really, really beautiful and I would say a bit haunting. I've read it several times and I cannot say for certain that I understand everything that he is saying. But what became very clear for me is sort of this idea of worshiping hope as the first step towards liberation and sort of opening up space for things other than Black Afrofuturism, or thinking about things other than Black optimism, to sort of approach nihilism and apostasy as a mode of estimating the odds for getting into a future. And just sort of thinking through again, you'll see this sort of repetition of these circles as well. Joshua Bennett is a poet who talks about many things, but found this essay where he was talking about sort of the end of the world. And he talks about sort of the violence against Black folks not being an aberration, but an algorithm, so it's predictable, we know it's gonna happen. It's not something that we should be surprised by, which a lot of folks have spoken about. And it made me think about ideas of the rapture. And it also made me think about Sun Ra's song, "It's after the end of the world, don't you know it yet?" And sort of this possibility that the world has already ended and we're still sort of in this phase of talking about the end of the world, and we're just, we're in the post-end of the world, and we're still in this sort of cradling of not knowing that. Which took me to Jim Jones, who's a great archivist, terrible man, but great archivist. He archived a lot of the sort of like nighttime conversations he had, and in one of them before the mass murder that he orchestrated, this woman here, Christine Miller, was this Black woman who is heard on this tape, which I'm not gonna play now, but she's heard on the tape basically pleading for him not to instruct everyone to kill themselves. And I always come back to this excerpt from Christine Miller because there's this moment of thinking about the rapture is not a predetermined point, but thinking about this white pastor sort of orchestrating a rapture for a group of Black folks that he had sort of led astray. And what does it mean to have certainty about the end of the world, but what does it mean to be able to assert agency in when you pass from this world? Which of course will always bring us to the dear people who have monetized this entire process. And thinking about the end of the world, and thinking about the context of doomsday and super rich folks who are prepping for it, millionaire bunkers, people who have already created real estate agencies that are designed to build homes just for the end of the world. And what does it mean to outrun the end of the world, and what does that mean for Black folks who have been trying to outrun their end of their world for quite some time, and the sort of the monetization of this process for other folks. And with that being said, climate change stuff obviously is a thing, but folks have been experiencing climate change impacts for quite some time. But new conversations about cooling down the earth by throwing this particular chemical into the atmosphere. Which, has anyone seen Snowpiercer? Yes, so we all know what happens. And Snowpiercer, it does not work out really well. But I mention all these things because these conversations about are we there yet, is the rapture close or not, are these conversations around sort of calculating or sort of trying to enumerate with some sense of certainty when this is all going to be over. And so the book that Kemi mentioned before, an approximate accumulation, an accumulation of approximate observations, was a work that functioned as a book, but also as an installation of sort of these alliterative phrases or sort of observations about current context. So things like anachronistic anger, obsolete outrage, ambidextrous allegiance, quarantine question, temporal twerk, aggregated apathy, homicidal hemline, soybean spaceship, kind killings, bedazzled body bags, superlative suffering, Orwellian overcoat, lethargic legislation, cumulative caskets, ugly uterus, Afrocentric autopsy, eventual extremism, pudgy power, moist machine, frugal fantasy, totalitarian threesome, offshore optimism, gluten-free graveyards, delicate drone. And so all of these are sort of designed and thinking about how do I compress some of the things that I'm observing into these smaller packets, thinking about the urgency of sort of this question of like how much time do I have left to articulate this. This is from a project that happened in 2016. It started in like late 2013. This is in Glasgow. And it's a project called How to Suffer Politely and Other Etiquette, and sort of came out of conversations I was having with myself, with my family, around expectations for poor Black folks with response to like suffering and trauma, and then it became expanded to sort of expectations around responses to trauma with relation to a lot of the murders of Black folks by police officers. So thinking about this policing of affect, policing of emotion, policing of how people process and digest trauma, and so thinking about the etiquette, this idea that we should make other people comfortable by making ourselves deeply uncomfortable and emotionally sick. So taking it like a man, but don't take it up with the man, lowering the pitch of your suffering, tell your struggle with triumphant humor, purchase the proper boots with which to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And as we end, thinking about this moment of just expanding. So I've spoken a lot about this attempt towards coherency and this attempt towards making everything neat and sort of trying to betray that tendency, and thinking about another name of Allah, al-Basit, which is the unfolder, the expander, the releaser, this idea of widening or giving abundance, and thinking about ways in my practice of trying to deal with abundance or widening. And thinking a lot about things like perimeters and things that hold shape. So I started doing research on memory foam and just like Tupperware. I got really deep into Tupperware research. That was like a big thing. And other things related to like shapes that hold. And during my daytime job, I worked as a curriculum developer, so I designed curriculum for 9th and 10th grade social studies in New York City. And I was working on something and came across this worksheet which was talking about you cannot find the perimeter because it is not a closed figure, and what the potential was of not being a closed figure to being a bit more porous, to being a bit more open, to not being able to be enclosed upon, and reminded me of some high school experiences. When I was in high school, I took an AP Lit class, and I was like super excited about it. So I was like, I love reading, I love writing, but my teacher was like, yo, you're not a good writer, and I was like, check me out now, lady. But she used to tell me that, she said when you write your sentences in paragraphs, you pack so much in, it's like you're going on a week-long journey, but you've packed for a month. And I was like, first of all, thank you so much for giving me such a beautiful description of how I'm not doing a good job. But also I kept holding on to that because it made me have such a complex about my writing, because she was saying that there was too much in a sentence, which made me think a lot about like grammar and the idea that a sentence can only hold so much. And Emily Dickinson is one of my problematic faves, because she's just, Emily Dickinson. And so she's in these conversations with Dickinson, who's the editor at The Atlantic, and they're going back and forth in correspondence, and he's trying to like help her be a better writer because she like is turning verbs to adjectives and doing whatever she wants. And so I think she's trolling him the entire time, and she writes this letter back to him where she says, "Dear friend, are these more orderly? I thank you for the truth. I had no monarch in my life and cannot rule myself. And when I try to organize, my little force explodes and leaves me bare and charred. I think you called me wayward. Will you help me improve?" And this woman had no interest in improving anything. And this is where my process was going. And so thinking about this idea of not having a monarch, or these attempts to organize, sort of like burning you, and thinking through myself and saying like, how does this apply to my own practice, and also how I think about how we historicize lived Black experiences, which brought me to Elizabeth Alexander, this essay she wrote back in 2007, where she's talking about Gwendolyn Brooks, and she says, I think of Gwendolyn Brooks' wonderful words, I am Black, I'm one of the Blacks, we occur everywhere. And I was like, yo, we occur everywhere. Such a beautiful articulation of having sort of like a vastness or an expansion or an abundance of existence that cannot be confined. Which I read after I made a bunch of work, and this sort of the wonderful things about making work and then like finding things later that align, but was working on this series where I was thinking about different verb tenses of Black. So like future perfect Black, past tense Black, past perfect Black, thinking about different moods of Black, thinking about grammars of Black, so what does it mean to be Black period, Black colon, Black comma, Black exclamation mark, ampersand, Black question mark, and these ideas of elaboration or abundance, or being able to fulfill a lot, having volume and vastness and not being flattened. And so a lot of the work ended up being sort of like occupied in my practice around using Xerox machines and the creation of a lot of work which you guys have already seen for this series called Supple Perimeter. This is the second activation I see in Philadelphia for a show that Meg only curated back in 2017. And I thought about the book as a container that I didn't want to be held in. So basically creating an installation of text and vinyl and larger pieces where it was almost like a book had been exploded or the book as a container had been removed. But still being situated in the container of a gallery space, but the container of a book or a page not being the constraint that I was working with. So I'm gonna pause. So I can always like keep talking. I'm gonna see if there are any questions, and then I'm gonna wrap up. Does that feel okay?
Yeah, let's take
Awesome.
one question.
And I only have like 6 minutes and I'm done, I promise.
So make it good, just kidding. But we would love to take one question, and we have a sort of reception, so there's time, there's beverages, there's snacks. Don't feel anxious that this is your last opportunity ever to stage a conversation about this wonderful talk.
I'm really not that scared. Yes,
Thank you for coming and sharing.
thank you.
I'm curious about words and text as the medium and how words, especially in text, can sort of be placeholders for a whole bunch of thoughts and ideas, and how that can be like multi-layered. And I'm curious about in your non-pursuit of uncertainty, in the pursuit of
Yes.
non-certainty or indeterminacy, how do you go about choosing the words, knowing they're multi-layered and sort of ever expansive, but also wanting to be legible?
Yeah. Excellent question. So I was going to talk about legibility at the end of this conversation. I did not plan this person at all. One of the things, and I will say this is still like an issue in my, not an issue, it's an issue for other people, it's not an issue for me. An issue that other people hold on to, is I remember having this conversation with a person who will not be named, but I had a conversation, I remember this person being like, I really love your work, but I find it a bit reticent. And when they said this to me, I think it was like super tired, so I had to like sort through my brain and be like, hold on, reticent, SAT word. I don't think that is positive. And I was like, oh, reticent, oh, I get what you're saying, cool. And I was like, okay, say more. And so this person was just like, I just feel like you're just trying to make me like do a lot of work. Like you really want me to like do work, and I just want you to like tell me what it's about. And I was like, cool. And sort of just sort of walked off. I remember crying that night, so I was like, oh, it's my job as an artist to make everything so legible that people are not engaged, so that people immediately get it, or is it to make it like opaque so there's an opportunity for like co-production? Like, what am I supposed to be doing? And I remember this person was not my husband at the time. Did I marry him yet? No, he was not my husband at the time. We were about to get married. He was like, he was having this conversation with me, and he was just like, well, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, I really trust that people are like intelligent people who don't want me to give it to them. So I like want to make stuff with people. Like I want it to be partially legible so that people have an entry point, but I also don't want to give it all away because I really do want people to co-produce with me. I don't want to say, here's a closed night meeting and that there's nothing else that you can make out of it. And so in my work, I definitely struggle with people being like, oh, I feel like I have to be here and spend a lot of time with it. I was like, yeah, exactly. I do want you to actually spend time with things. I do want you to like figure stuff out. I do want you to have a question. I do want you to come to a public program and like have a tense conversation with me about something that didn't make sense, because I think that learning is an important part of making sense of art and making sense of yourself. And so I think for me, I never get too caught up on like, is this the right word? Because it's never gonna be the right word, or it's never gonna be the right anything. The fact that it will never be the right anything means that there will always be a space for conversation. So I'm like super excited when something doesn't work or something works, because either way there's like a space for conversation. So I'm gonna wrap up super quickly. Thank you so much for that question. I usually start with this quote I made in my presentations. It's a quote from an interview that Octavia Butler did with Sam and Delaney back in 1996 at MIT, where he's asking her, and people were asking her about internet and hypertext, and she's like, no, I don't do that, but she says she believes in something called a primitive hypertext, which is like in her way of processing the world, she basically allows her brain to like, sort of like wander and drift. And in that process of wandering and drifting, she's able to build these relationships between things that don't seem like they connect. So this idea of following a thought down the rabbit hole, or allowing things to sort of like marinate together, is really interesting to me, because I struggled, even though I was a good student, I still struggled in school with the idea that the only way for me to be a good student was to have a linear pathway of understanding something, and being like, the bird outside is super interesting, let me get up and go see what the bird outside is doing, then I'll come back and do this task, but feeling deeply that all this stimuli was important for my processing, and finding this quote being really validating in that sense. And so part of my practice is really about giving other folks an opportunity to also engage in that wandering experience. And so these library takeovers are basically sort of organized around this idea of having abandoned the flimsy fantasy of certainty, I decided to wander. And so folks are given these scorecards that actually just invite them to wander through a library. So find a pink book, draw an image that represents the last word on the last page of the book. And so there are tons of them. This happened at Brooklyn Public Library in early 2019 and lasted through April. It's at Haverford College from late October through November or through December. There are a couple other products that are in the process of developing. And a lot of folks came out and did it. I like that it was in a public library because it's a cross-section of everyone basically. And so once people engaged in the activity, we took what people had written down, and then through public programming, we got together and we wrote songs together. So this is a workshop with Morgan Bassicus, who is amazing, and we basically had a set of 40 words, and with like 20 people wrote a song together that we recorded as an MP3, which all the participants got. We also worked with Anne Dupont, who was also amazing, and runs the Afrofuturistic residency program in Iowa. And together with him, we wrote a set of like a collective poem. And with Brass Burlesque, which is a queer folks of color burlesque group, put together a dance using these words as sort of prompts. So this idea of engaging people, allowing people to wander, allowing people and encouraging people to do things and wander throughout a space and wander through experiences is super important. So as we end on a lot of stuff, and I'm hot, I wanted to end on this note of secret languages, opacity, evasiveness, and counter surveillance. And the last name of law that I'll talk about is Al-Batin, which is talking about something that's hidden or secret or inner, sort of like thinking about interiority, which is a really big concern for me because there's an assumption that Black folks should always make what they feel, understand visible and legible to everyone else, even though no one else is doing it. But there's an expectation for complete transparency because folks need to be nosy in ways that it's not expected of other folks. And so this is an excerpt from Zora Neale Hurston's Of Mules and Men, where she's talking about collecting folklore. It's one of my favorite quotes from her. And she writes, "And the Negro, in spite of his open-faced laughter, his seemingly acquiescence is particularly evasive. You see, we are polite people, and we do not say to our questioner, 'Get out of here.' We smile and tell him or her something that satisfies the white person, because knowing so little about us, he doesn't know what he is missing. The Indian resists curiosity by a stony silence. The Negro offers a feather-bed resistance. That is, we let the probe enter, but it never comes out. It gets smothered under a lot of laughter and pleasantries. The theory behind our tactics. The white man is always trying to know into someone else's business. All right, I'll set something outside the door of my mind for him to play with and handle. He can read my writing, but he sure can't read my mind. I'll put this play toy in his hand, and he will seize it and go away. Then I will say my say and sing my song." And so it's one of the most beautiful things I have ever read, because it reminds me just like basic things that my mother used to tell us when we were kids. It's like, she was always just warning around nosy people and stop telling your family's business. And this wasn't like hide problems, but it was like people are super nosy. Why is that person asking questions? Just smile in their face and just nod. And so sort of this very soft and quiet resistance around being very careful about how you're saying things, who you're saying things to, and developing sort of this understated politics and language systems to articulate things as a mode of counter-surveillance. And so thinking about ideas of like logic being the organizing system for how we articulate things, the idea of not knowing anything by logic, but having your own set of logic. And this project that I did through an organization in Philadelphia where they were asking me to make a set of prints, and I was like, dude, I'm tired, I have nothing else to give, and I'm tired of people asking me to like share things. Like, y'all always ask me like, what do I think about this? And so what came out of that project was sort of thinking about this compulsion towards Black legibility. And so I made a set of prints. One is sort of thinking about this idea of what something seems like. The other one is thinking about this idea of an anti-dance, so refusal to dance. And this idea of not being here, but being here. Miss Wilkes is one of the women who started the Nairobi schools in my city. And in the book, The Day School, she includes this small excerpt, or someone who's writing about her includes a small excerpt where it says, "When Mrs. Wilkes runs short of patience, she says so. She cannot tolerate a false front. She has no respect for those who wear their blackness like a fashion fad, who will contribute no part of themselves to the community or the cause of liberation. If you're looking for my natural," she explains, "it's inside. If you're not a doer, you might just as well get a process job. And to the white world, she stays firmly time and again, white folks must disqualify themselves from thinking for black people. You cannot do it anymore. You don't know how to think for us. Furthermore, it is highly insulting because you are trying to treat our men like boys. You have got to stop because we won't stand for it any longer. And so this is just, again, this reminder around interiority, this idea that I carry something on the inside that you may not be able to read, but you seem very thirsty for that ability to like see and make sense of me. And just to wrap up, for real. There's no, I don't know how many folks heard this growing up, but I remember hearing this a lot when my parents would watch the news and someone like, so-and-so was like a serial killer, like, so like, this person is like a bad politician. And I remember family, well, we didn't do that. Like, you guys are late to the game. And so started creating a body of work around this assertion of like, we've been new, or having this sort of like secret composite of knowledge that's organized around other folks' refusal to validate epistemologies that operate outside of academic institutions, but otherwise still exist as like fruitful grounds for making sense of the world and thinking back to Zora Nerston, of giving just enough that people will leave you alone, but being able to have your own communities of secret language, of secret epistemologies that sort of help you navigate and survive through things. And we're done. Thank you.